History will judge today as pivotal, declares President Obama, as the world's two biggest polluters, the USA and China, commit to cutting carbon emissions. Good evening. It's set to be the hottest year on record, and they're responsible for 40% of the world's CO2 emissions. But now the US and China will formally ratify the Paris Agreement on climate change. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Theresa May heads to the G20 summit in China, focused on trade. Will it be just another reminder of Britain's smaller place on the planet? Also tonight, plans to ban obese patients from surgery to try and save money are called the most severe restriction the NHS would ever see. Amid fears that a Polish worker was killed in a hate crime, British Poles hold a silent vigil in an Essex town. And Turkey rolls its tanks further into Syria, targeting both the Islamic State group and Kurdish militias, who are also fighting IS. So the Prime Minister is on her way to China, while Theresa May made clear on departure that her priority is Brexit-bound Britain's relations with that ever-growing superpower. The central concerns of this week's G20 summit is that of climate change. Both China and the United States announced this morning that they had ratified the Paris Agreement to limit the rise in global temperatures and turn around the rise in greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. Diana Magnay has this.
The end of summer in South Carolina looks like this. Hurricane Hermine, one more extreme weather event in the US linked to rising sea levels and climate change. States across the American South in the last 15 months experiencing the kind of rainfall normally seen every 500 years. It's why the US president stopped off on the tiny coral island of Midway on Thursday to show the impact of climate change on marine life in the Pacific. And it's why, despite a small altercation on arrival between US and Chinese security detail, President Obama and China's President Xi Jinping made ratification of last year's Paris climate change deal the starting point for their talks at this year's G20.
Both the United States and China were leading by example as the world's two largest economies and two largest emitters. Our entrance into this agreement continues the momentum of Paris and should give the rest of the world confidence, whether developed or developing countries, that a low-carbon future is where the world is heading.
That China has put such an emphasis on climate change at this year's G20 in the city of Hangzhou is evidence of a huge shift in attitude from the world's largest polluter.
I think they're realizing that the domestic air quality and health issues for China are largely aligned with the climate agenda. So I think it's bringing home this central point that climate action gives you cleaner air and makes the best use of natural resources. And the finance is now aligning, so it's a good sign.
Hangzhou right now is all blazing sunshine. China's encouraged most residents to take paid breaks away. And they've turned off the steel mills around the city to keep pollution down for their international guests. For the Paris Agreement to go into effect, 55 countries representing 55% of global carbon emissions need to sign up. With China and the US, 26 countries have now ratified, accounting for around 40% of global emissions. If the EU joins in, that would bring the total up to 50%. And once the target's reached, it'll go into effect 30 days later.
Brexit means Brexit.
And that makes everything just a bit more complicated. EU emissions targets have to be ratified by each individual member state. If Britain's not a part of that in the not-too-distant future, those details might take longer to iron out. Theresa May also has Hinkley Point to mull over on her way out on, let's call it, May Force One, a matter she'll be bringing up with the Chinese president, alongside the message to her international counterparts that Britain's still open for business.
This is a golden era for UK-China relations, and one of the things I'll be doing at the G20 is obviously talking to President Xi about how we can develop the strategic partnership that we have between the UK and China.
Golden era perhaps, but not without its problems. If pushing for climate action is a legacy issue for the US president in the twilight of his term, For Theresa May, it's more of a sidebar in the tumultuous dawn of hers.
Well, here the government has announced plans to ban environment-damaging plastic microbeads from cosmetics and cleaning products by the end of next year. Microbeads are used in items such as toothpastes and exfoliating body scrubs. A single shower can send 100,000 plastic pieces down the drains and ultimately into the oceans, where they can find their way into the food chain. Now, a health authority has tonight agreed to review plans to deny surgery for non-life-threatening conditions to obese people and smokers. NHS England had called on the Vale of York Clinical Commissioning Group in North Yorkshire to think again about the plans. But it's just the latest example of health rationing schemes aimed at meeting an NHS cash squeeze.
The Vale of York Commissioning Group had said patients would only be allowed routine surgery such as hip and knee replacements within a year if they shed 10% of their body weight, while smokers would have to wait 6 months for surgery unless they quit their habit for 8 weeks. The authority have now agreed to review plans at the request of NHS England and in the face of a barrage of criticism such as this.
It's discriminatory because it unfairly affects quite a significant proportion of the population who have a painful problem and who are being denied for treatment.
The Royal College of Surgeons found 1 in 3 clinical commissioning groups across England are denying or delaying non-urgent surgery to patients until they stop smoking or lose weight. The RCS said this ban would be the most severe yet.
Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Omar Khan, who performs weight loss surgery. Omar, first of all, the NHS group involved says that it is under severe pressure. Surely you appreciate and understand what that's like.
I think we all know about the pressures that the NHS is under financially, but I think the real question mark in this case is they've actually openly said this is a financial decision. I can understand the rationale if they said it's about improving outcomes and getting patients to lose weight so that they get better clinical outcomes, but here they've been quite overt in saying it's about cash, and that is something which is quite concerning.
But this is a reality that the NHS is facing. Finance matters.
Finance does matter, and I think we do have to have an open and honest debate about what we pay for and what we don't. But I don't like the idea that we're picking out particular groups and saying, purely for monetary reasons, that if you're a smoker, if you're morbidly obese, for example, we will not give you surgery, in the hope, frankly, not that their clinical outcome gets better because they lose weight, in the hope that basically people aren't given the operations and the trusts and CCGs can save money.
Is it your fear that obese people are somehow an easy group to pick on and that this is a slippery slope?
I think obese patients are a very easy group to pick on, and we see that the rationing would not be applied to any other group other than obese patients. And there's this idea that obesity, basically it's self-inflicted and therefore people don't deserve care, and that's a very dangerous argument to go down.
And this suggestion that there are other cases where the NHS is being rationed, have you come across it?
There's nothing overt, and I think this is the first time actually I've heard of overt rationing. But I think on a day-to-day basis, we do struggle with finances. We do struggle on a sort of case-by-case basis in trying to do the work we need to do.
And what's it like when you're making those case-by-case decisions?
Well, I think we do have guidance. We have, for example, NICE, which gives us very clear guidance for quite a few clinical cases. But it is very difficult. The reality is the NHS doesn't have a bottomless pit of money. We are, on a daily basis, trying to do the best for our patients, but it is getting more and more difficult.
Well, you say it's getting more and more difficult. Both you and the Royal College of Surgeons are calling for an honest debate. What does that actually mean? Well,
I think we actually have to have engagement, not just with the CCGs who commission the work, hospitals, patients, doctors. We all have to sit down and work out what we are prepared to fund and what we're not. And there are groups which are going to end up losing out. I mean, in the past we've talked about things like fertility treatments, a classic example where certain CCGs don't pay for it. And we collectively, as a society, need to decide what a nationally funded service will pay for and what a nationally funded service will not pay for.
So as someone on the front line, what would you yourself say the NHS needs to stop paying for?
It's a very difficult one to do because every time you mention something, you will have people who are obviously affected by it. But I would say that, for example, things like some of the cosmetic surgery that we offer, there is an argument against it. But again, I'd have plastic surgical colleagues who'd argue with me. So
is it your position that the NHS cannot carry on offering everything it does, according to the current model of funding?
I think under the current model of funding, we're under severe strains. And I do think that long term, there is a sustainability issue, yes.
So something's got to give, basically?
I think we're going to have to make some very tough decisions in the near future.
Omar Khan, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, hundreds of British Poles have staged a vigil in Harlow in Essex in the wake of the killing of a man in a suspected hate crime. Arkadiusz Jóźwik died last week after an attack outside a takeaway shop in the town. The organisers of today's event say they are concerned at the effect of the Brexit vote on community relations. Now, Pádraig O'Brien is in Harlow tonight. Pádraig, what's the latest?
Well, around this time last Saturday, Arek Jóźwik would have been washing his paintbrushes after a DIY job with a friend. They grabbed some pizza in the pizzeria behind me and sat on this bench. Some hours later, a group of young people set upon them, and 48 hours after that, Arek lost his life. Today, hundreds of people showed up to pay silent tribute to a silent man. There was something quintessentially Polish about the vigil this afternoon. Although not the only community represented, a huge crowd, normally too busy working, showed up on a Saturday to quietly reflect on the life of a quiet man. And when people tried to talk, words escaped them. How are you feeling? Are you okay?
No, there's...
Yep, what?
I'm sorry.
People invested in Britain perceived what happened here as a letdown. Words escaped them too. It's affected you a lot, hasn't it?
It did, because I wanted to live. I wanted to leave this place. I wanted to go back to my country after so many years here, and building my own future here. Building, I met my wife here. I've got, I've got a beautiful daughter, and yeah.
So you were invested in this country?
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, we have to stop. Sorry, I can't talk anymore.
6 teenagers were arrested in connection with what happened here. One 16-year-old, 5 15-year-olds. They were all on bail until October. It's important to reiterate again that Essex police are pursuing the possibility of this as a race hate crime as just one of different lines of inquiry. Whatever the motivation, though, what's happened has touched a very raw nerve in a very large Polish community here in Harlow. So personal the reaction, Arek's parish priest, here for 24 years, was blaming himself.
My job, as I said, is to share my faith about someone who is love, in whose image I was created. My God is love, forgiveness, mercy. And if I don't do my job, if I don't go out and preach this message in this, as I said, not only a preaching way, but in a human way, I am also the one who is responsible.
Again, the motives for this crime are still unclear. The consequences, though, are not. A life of a loved one lost. A community set on maintaining the moral high ground.
Turkey claims to have killed or injured more than 100 Kurdish PKK fighters, losing 5 of their own troops in exchanges in northern Syria. Separately, US and Turkish forces have launched attacks on Islamic State militants close to the Turkish border. Earlier, a convoy of Turkish tanks were filmed crossing the border near the Syrian village of Al-Rai, which has been contested between IS and rebel groups backed by Turkey in recent weeks. The groups under the banner of the Free Syrian Army say they've captured a series of villages in the area from the IS militants. Thousands of people have lined the streets of 2 cities in Uzbekistan to view the funeral cortege of the country's president and dictator, Islam Karimov. Karimov, who had been the autocratic leader of the country for 27 years, died in hospital following a massive stroke. His cortege left the capital Tashkent at dawn, making its way to the airport, from where his coffin was flown to his home city of Samarkand for a private burial. His death has left a power vacuum at the head of the former Soviet state. Now, residents of the semi-autonomous district of Christiania in the Danish capital Copenhagen have destroyed market stalls where cannabis was being sold following a shooting incident there earlier this week. The Christiania district, which was taken over by squatters 45 years ago, is a popular tourist attraction famed for its colourful houses, as well as its soft drugs trade.
Set inside central Copenhagen's thriving waterfront tourist thoroughfares, Christiania and its 84 acres are a car-free, self-proclaimed neighbourhood. The 900 residents have their own flag, their own currency and their own set of rules independent of the government. Stealing, violence, guns and hard drugs were banned, as were cameras, but soft drugs were sold openly. There have been occasional riots over the years, as authorities tried to regain more control of the area and clamp down on the drugs trade, and occasional shooting incidents as outside gangs tried to move in on the cannabis dealers. After this week's incident, which left the gunman dead and a police officer in a critical condition, the residents took matters into their own hands. Armed with tools and carts, they removed the iconic imagery and demolished the booths along the famed Pusher Street that was selling cannabis. They even took one booth and reinstalled it outside Copenhagen's Parliament building. One resident said that the cannabis trade was as much the government's problem as theirs.
Well, in Italy, a dog has been found alive and well after being trapped for 9 days in a house demolished by last month's earthquake. The golden retriever called Romeo was pulled from the rubble by the fire brigade. His owner had gone back to the house in Amatrice to retrieve some belongings and heard muffled barking sounds. After being given water and a quick check-over, the dog appeared to be none the worse for his ordeal. At least 293 people died when the quake struck the region on August the 24th. Tennis, and Britain's Kyle Edmund and Johanna Konta have reached the fourth round of the men's and women's singles of the US Open. Edmund will play world number one Novak Djokovic after beating John Isner to reach the last 16 of a Grand Slam tournament for the first time. Konta also reached the fourth round after defeating Belinda Bencic in straight sets. Andy Murray and Dan Evans will attempt to join them later tonight. Formula One and Britain's Lewis Hamilton will start in pole position in tomorrow's Italian Grand Prix. The World Championship leader set the fastest lap time in today's qualifying session at Monza. Hamilton's Mercedes teammate and rival Nico Rosberg is second on the grid. Ferrari's Sebastian Vettel is third. Our main news tonight: the United States and China have ratified a plan aimed at tackling climate change. The move came at the start of the G20 summit in the Chinese city of Hangzhou. We're back tomorrow at the earlier time of 5:30. Until then, that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.